I'm Jim Check. You're watching KelownaNow. I have with me pollster Mario Canseco. I think this is our third call, and I think we're going to have a couple more with the way that the BC election's going. What are people in BC feeling right now? You did a poll. I think it just came out today, right?
Yes, the situation hasn't changed that much when you look at the numbers on a province-wide basis. It's the NDP ahead by 1 point of the Conservatives, essentially a statistical tie. The Greens way behind at 9%. The regional breakdowns are what's interesting because we do see the Conservatives gaining a little bit in Metro Vancouver, not enough to make this a significantly competitive area, and holding on to their base of support in northern BC, southern BC, and the Fraser Valley. So they're running up the numbers in places where the seats aren't there. If the Conservatives manage to do a little bit better in Metro Vancouver, I think the election could be as close as the one we had in 2017. But at this stage, the NDP is holding on to a lot of the seats that they won in 2020 in Metro Vancouver, even if there's other areas where they're certainly going to be losing some members of the Legislative Assembly, particularly in the Fraser Valley.
So there's a little bit of a juxtaposition because Premier Eby seems to poll very well as himself, or John Rustad polls a little bit behind, but then the parties themselves kind of poll evenly.
This really speaks about the emotional connection that needs to be established in the latter stages of the campaign for a government to change. This is something that I always measure when I do political polling. And you look at a place like Manitoba, where Wab Kinew was seen as the best premier in the latter stages of an election that the NDP won fairly handily. Similar situation with Doug Ford in 2018. Similar situation with Philippe Legault in Quebec in 2018. So there's this moment when people sort of gravitate towards a figure that is going to deliver the change that they're looking for. And even though we have a significantly close race when it comes to voting, we're not seeing that level of emotional connection with voters with John Rostad. So if in the next couple of weeks, John Rostad starts to get better on the best premier question. Right now, he's trailing by 8 points. But if this becomes a statistical tie on that question, or even if John Rostad ends up ahead of David Eby, then we know that the government is changing.
So how much of like that, we've talked about this before, the Pierre Poilievre connection, how much do you think that still is playing out in BC? Do you think that he'll get a little bit of Pierre Poilievre kind of love as opposed to like that John Rustad thing?
Well, I think they've really played it very well. I think part of what they've achieved is John Rostad certainly comes across as somebody who's very even-keeled, somebody who knows what he's thinking about, speaks softly, has to be tough when he has to. It's very different from the way in which Pierre Poilievre is communicating, which is more boastful. And of course, a significant departure from the stream of consciousness that is a Donald Trump press conference in the United States. So that certainly helps seal the deal. There's a lot of people who have been with the Conservatives from the start and tend to be more likely to vote Conservative at the federal level. But there's also really a lot of people who would have voted for BC United who are looking at the BC Conservatives as an option. It hasn't been perfect. We do see about 30% of those who voted for the Liberals in 2020 under Andrew Wilkinson saying that they'll vote for the NDP. But 6 out of 10 are saying, okay, let's just go with the BC Conservatives because they are closer ideologically to the center-right party that BC United or the BC Liberals used to be.
The NDP seem to be running a fairly negative campaign. They're still even digging out tweets. I think they published another one today. They're like going through every candidate's like social media and digging out these tweets. Do you think that's an effective campaign, or is that kind of getting tired with people?
I think we're in a very different time. Going back to 2009, for instance, you had candidates who were kicked out of the list before it was finalized due to something that happened. I think there's a couple of fundamental changes when we compare how we felt about these things just a few years ago and the way we do now. One of them is there's a lot of young people who grew up with social media. Now these people are of a voting age and looking at things very differently. They might be able to look at some of those old tweets and say, it's okay, maybe I said the same thing and it's somewhere online. But our ability to be really upset about the way a specific politician feels about something is something that we've become completely desensitized, especially after 2016.
It seems to be an overplayed hand, that cancel culture, especially when people like when they tried to cancel, figures like Joe Rogan, and then it kind of backfired and actually elevated his like popularity as opposed to try to diminish him. And you've seen the same thing with Elon Musk, who now has 193 million followers, and I think he would say any publicity is good publicity, right? So it seems to have waned a bit.
Well, and it's not something that is going to change things. There's a moment when you figure out what to do with the candidates, and essentially call out the leader for having candidates like that. That moment has passed. The list is not going to change. I don't see a scenario where somebody is going to ask a candidate to step aside. And I think this is one of the reasons for the momentum scores for all three leaders to be as low as they are. Sonia Furstenau is trying to say where she wants to take her own party. They're not running a full slate, so that is also problematic. We run into people who want to vote Green and can't because they just couldn't get the signatures. But it's been mostly negative. It's been a sort of back and forth between, this guy has done a terrible job governing, don't vote for him, and this guy is very dangerous, he's going to take away certain things that you like, don't vote for him. And that usually shows itself as people saying, my opinion of these people really hasn't changed. So the next couple of weeks are going to be crucial for this. There's an opportunity to connect on platforms, on a vision for the province. Because right now, all we're getting, especially from the sound bites that get played over and over again, is don't trust the other guy.
Yeah, they are handing out the candy quite a bit, both parties, but it seems like a lot of the candy that's being handed out by the NDP is a backtrack from their original tougher, stances on carbon tax and, various things. They've kind of like backpedaled on, like even, like forced care for people and stuff like that. So it seems like a lot of the stuff that, the Conservatives have been, especially, on the federal level, and John Rustad, that have been pushing for, and all of a sudden the NDP is willing to listen.
Well, it's an important component of the platform for sure. There's what I see very differently this time around, comparing with other BC elections that I've had the privilege to cover. The over 55 voter is now more likely to look at the NDP as the stable option. This is a complete departure from the elections that we've had in this century, where the over 55s were more likely to say, I'm sticking with Gordon Campbell and with Christy Clark. It was the 18 to 34 voter who was more progressive, more center-left. I like the NDP's views on education and healthcare and housing. That voter is desperate for change. So It's a complete departure. You have a party that is ready to really focus on the over 55s and is not doing that well. And a party that has usually taken the youth vote for granted, now completely shocked at the fact that the 18 to 34-year-olds are saying John Rostad is my candidate.
Yeah, that's likely due to a lot of disillusionment by the young people. Like no chance to get a house, inflation's really high, jobs market's getting tighter, lots of layoffs and all that kind of stuff. So I think, they're just like, how do we get it better tomorrow? And then maybe the older people are saying, well, I'd rather just stay the course.
Well, and I think that is part of the reason for the emphasis on healthcare, particularly yesterday, even though we ended up talking about plastic straws for most of the afternoon. But the emphasis on healthcare, it's an important issue for the over 55s. This could help the NDP close the deal. The whole pledge about everybody having a family doctor, it might be very complicated to do, but it's the kind of thing that speaks to the over 55 voter who we know casts ballots at a higher rate than their younger counterparts. The challenge for the Conservatives is they probably have a lot of experience getting the vote out when it comes to calling people on the phone, figuring out if they cast a ballot or not, giving them a ride to the polls. How do you connect with the 18 to 34-year-olds who aren't really used to this? And that is going to be one of the challenges that they're facing in this campaign.
So in the Okanagan here, we do have a fairly popular independent slate. Do you do any polling that kind of figures where they're going to end up? Is that a danger for Rustad in like the seats that would typically be his, and then maybe, they might go to an independent or split the vote?
I think there's still that chance. Part of what makes this a little bit easier now is you have a final list of candidates. There were some independents who thought about running and chose not to. There's others who are very well known. But part of the complexity, particularly for those who are formerly elected as BC Liberals, is do you have the ability to get the vote out? People like Karen Kirkpatrick, Tom Shipitka, Mike Bernier, they benefited from a platform within the BC Liberal Party that allowed people to call, to do the things that they needed, and to get the vote out. Will they be able to have the same resources now that they're running as independents? I think that is going to be complicated. And the other issue that definitely doesn't help independents is when the election is as close as this one, people tend to gravitate towards selecting a government. Maybe you love your independent candidate in your riding, but if you don't want the Conservatives to get in, you just vote for the NDP, or the other way around. If you're somebody who's very happy with the way things are going, but wants to change things, would you be better off electing more Conservatives than to send an independent and maybe not have the balance of power? So it's going to be a very difficult campaign for independents. I know that they like this notion of maybe having 5 or 6 of them, maybe a couple of Greens holding the balance of power, but it's very difficult to do unless you assemble as a party. I think there's a parallel universe where these people get together, they form a bloc, call it the Bloc Colombois if you want. And you have the opportunity to get into debates and to get a very different mindset for the residents than just saying, remember me, you used to vote for me as a BC Liberal, now I'm running on my own.
Yeah, likely most people see the logo when they go put their name on the ballot or put their X on that ballot there. How many more polls will you run in BC before the 19th?
Probably 2 more. I think that's the best course of action. We usually do one on the final day of the campaign because you always have the possibility of people changing their minds on the final stages. I'm really curious to see how the numbers move after the debate. And not necessarily because of the debate itself, but the kind of soundbite that we share the next day. What is going to make it to WhatsApp or to Instagram? What messages are the parties going to use to connect, and whether somebody can score a good knockout punch on the other. But I mean, right now, the election is there for the taking. If Rostad establishes an emotional connection with voters, then he'll win this thing. If David Eby manages to reconnect with young voters and sell them a vision of a province where they will be a part of.
Both of them should be listening right now, right? You're giving out good advice.
Yes, exactly. Because this is how elections are won. The platforms work, you can attack your opponent, but unless people feel that something is at stake, if the other party gets in, incumbents don't get that final push. Or if somebody looks at the opposition leader as the person they want running the show, you climb on the best premier question, your voting numbers are steady, and the government is blue.
Advanced voting is already open. It'd be interesting to see how much of it is advanced voting and how much of it will be election day voting. Any thoughts on that?
It's tricky to compare with 2020 because a lot of us voted by mail back then. And in 2017, we didn't have as many opportunities to vote as we do now. So it's really tough to look at how much that will mean. And part of it is also the ability of people to do things differently. Now we're in a very different stage of our lives compared to 2017. You have more people working from home, people who may have moved. The other wild card is just how much the riding boundaries have changed. I've talked to people who believe that they're still in a riding where they are no longer in. So that's also problematic. You might like your MP, your MLA who you elected back in 2020, but if you're a couple of blocks away from the line, you're not voting for them anymore.
I think it'll be interesting to see how much John Rustad can motivate that younger base that seems to be gravitating towards him, because that's a demographic that doesn't vote a lot, and it'd be interesting to see what they get for percentages out there.
Well, it's definitely crucial. And looking at the history of voting, the first election is always fun for people. When you're 18 to 22 or 23, you participate, you read about it, you're really into the system. It's the second election where the level of voter support from that group drops. People between 25 and 30 who go, this doesn't matter, it's all the same, I don't trust anybody. So how can you figure out a way to connect with that group that is probably disenchanted with politics? They might take a survey, they might say they're upset with the way things are going, but if there's something good on television or it's a rainy night, you never know if they're going to show up.
You've got a busy schedule in front of you, right? You got that Manitoba election, or Saskatchewan election. And how's that one looking? We'll just take a couple seconds on that one.
I think it'll be closer than before. We're talking about a party that has dominated politics since 2007. there's always that situation where the governments tend to get a little bit tiresome, and this is usually what happens in the prairies. You go through 2 or 3 terms, and then somebody else has to come in. This is the way in which the Saskatchewan Party came in 2007. It wasn't necessarily that the NDP was mismanaging everything. It's just people felt that it was time for change, and I think there's a chance to have a situation similar to the one we saw in Manitoba. If the NDP can really coalesce around a couple of the urban cores and maybe get a few seats in the rural areas, this could be a significantly close election. But it's quite interesting because a year ago people were saying both of these elections are cakewalks for the incumbents, and now it's looking like they will both be decided by just a couple of points.
When do you start doing your polls in the United States? Because if you look at some of the polls down there, they're a lot different, right? Some have, Kamala Harris winning, and some have Donald Trump winning, and then depending on who's doing the poll. And I would trust your poll more because you're obviously not as biased more. But what do you see? When do you start polling down there, and what do you see what's going on down there right now?
We start this weekend. We're going to be doing some national polls and also looking into some of the battleground states. So we're starting with what the Americans like to call the big blue wall: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, states that Hillary Clinton thought she had won back in 2016, and Joe Biden ultimately brought back to the Democrats in 2020. What I'm looking for more than anything is how is this going to resonate, particularly when it comes to young voters who are looking at Kamala Harris as an option, and also the type of connection that we see from women. This election could ultimately be decided by women because you have Kamala Harris on the ticket, but also because of everything that's happened related to the Roe v. Wade decision and what the Supreme Court tried to do. So that is the group that I'm really interested in. I mean, looking at the findings back from 2016, Hillary Clinton's victory as far as the popular vote was never in doubt, but we never saw that level of emotional connection from women. They voted Democratic because they usually did. So if this is different, if you start to see women who usually voted Republican giving a second look to the Democrats, she could win this thing by 4 or 5 points.
But then you look at Pierre Poilievre here in Canada, you look at Donald Trump, and you look at some of the rallies that they do. It seems like they both kind of have like a rock star status. Does that not play into kind of just the emotional support that's for either Trump or Poilievre?
I think that is definitely part of it. It's easier to sell this idea when you haven't been there before. I think that definitely benefits Poilievre because he can say, once we get elected and we remove all of these problems and we deal with the bureaucracy, everything is going to be a little bit easier. It's a tougher sell for Trump because he had to deal with the pandemic, and people still have very clear memories of what that was like. So, you will always have a scenario where about 35-40% of Americans will vote for the Republican candidate no matter who he is.
Mm-hmm. Now, they're born a Republican, born a Democrat, and I've been down there visiting some friends, and there's just they just don't listen, right? It's just it's what you are is what you are, and the families a lot of families vote that way, and sometimes they ostracize somebody that wants to vote outside the family.
Well, and it's particularly crucial in states where a couple of counties that are fairly urban can win you the entire state. I mean, Michigan is an interesting example. Cook County, where Detroit is, Barack Obama gets 90% of the vote. That's all he needs. He could lose every other county that is more Republican. And I think that is part of the essence of the argument for the Harris campaign. Really knock on doors on those urban areas. It doesn't help to go into places where 70% of the population is Republican. You're going to be chased out of there pretty quickly.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I'd love to book a time with you right after you do your first poll in the U.S. because I think that is going to be like it's going to be entertainment on the next level, right? Once that election hits full force, and then let's bring it all the way back to home. And Pierre's pushing votes of non-confidence, one after another, and both between the Bloc and the NDP, they seem to be still. I think the Bloc has made a threat now too, but how much of this discontentment, because you can see it in the polls, ends up on Jagmeet Singh and the Bloc if they continue to support this Liberal government that most Canadians obviously want? It looks like they want an election.
I think it can certainly hurt them. And one of the reasons is if people have already decided that they want to do away with the government that they have in place, they're going to see them as a distraction and an obstacle for the change that they desire. I don't think it would be wise to try to topple the government and force a campaign that would take us through the holidays. It worked out well for the Conservatives in 2005, 2006, but there's no guarantee that this is the type of situation that we could enjoy at a moment like this. And I think part of the complexity for the opposition is just how do I connect on this? And this is a situation that is particularly dire for the NDP. You could win a couple of points here or there and maybe get to a level where you're tied with the Liberals and maybe even surpass them by a couple of points. It might not be enough to get you where you want to go. For the NDP to be competitive, they need to be closer to 30 or 32% because of the way their vote is distributed. This is what happened with Jack Layton back in 2011, and they formed the official opposition. So having the Liberals and the NDP tied at, let's say, 24, 25%, it doesn't help anybody. It's a dream scenario for the Conservatives, similar to the one David Eby would have enjoyed if BC United had continued in the race.
So the last poll I saw wasn't your poll, but there was a poll that had the Liberals finishing in fourth place behind the NDP in the bloc. What does that do to the Liberal Party? Like, obviously, that's a complete rework, wouldn't that be?
Well, you can go back to 2011. I think that's a good example of this. A party that is called usually the naturally governing party, getting less than 20% of the vote at the national level, getting 13% of the vote in BC and only securing 2 seats. People thought they were done. And, suddenly Justin Trudeau comes in and the stars align in 2015 for the comeback that we saw. So it's definitely more complicated now because we don't know who that figure is going to be. And, back in 2011, very few people thought, it's okay, Justin Trudeau will save us. Who knows what the party will do after this and what type of race are we going to be imagining when it comes to who is going to be representing that party. But one thing is clear, it's not easy to rebuild a governing party in this day and age. You look at the example of the Liberals in Ontario. They've gone through several leadership changes and a lot of confusion related to their brand, and they just can't get their act together in a way that makes people look at them as an alternative to the Doug Ford government. A similar situation could be happening here. And the expectations for a Poilievre government are going to be through the roof. People will want to see a solution to housing and specific issues related to financial matters that may not arrive as quickly as they hope. So it might be a very, very short honeymoon. I look at the situation in the United Kingdom. It's not as if it was a significant landslide for Labour. But here we are just weeks after the election, and people are saying he's not delivering what he promised.
It's a big mess to clean up for sure. I think a lot of people don't realize how big of a mess it is. There was a piece out by Kevin O'Leary saying we have one of the worst managers of our country and an asset-rich resource, but it takes a long time to turn a ship, right? To turn it back to what a lot of people are expecting to happen in a hurry, right? Do you think there'll be election in the spring or the fall?
I think it'll be in the spring. I think the government probably will fall by February or March. Then we'll head into an election in the spring. It really depends on where the Liberals want to go with this, because part of what could happen is if Justin Trudeau steps down, you give the party the courtesy to reassemble itself, to choose a new leader, and then you try to figure out if they want to campaign under a new leader that quickly. It didn't go very well for John Turner back in 1984. It could be a similar situation for whoever takes over if Justin Trudeau decides that he doesn't want to do this anymore. But aside from that, I think there's an opportunity for the opposition parties to say this is where we're going. For the Bloc to ultimately be the official opposition again would be a monumental milestone.
Do you think his personality would want him to, would he want to run again, or would his party convince him that there is no hope if he's at the helm?
I think he wants to do this. I've said for the past couple of years that I think part of what we have is an expectation that he'll probably surpass the number of days served by Jean Chrétien. And after that happens, that'll be the moment to say, okay, now I'm ahead of Chrétien in the list of longest serving prime ministers. now I'm going to take my walk in the sun or in the
Do you
sand
think
because he likes to go to Tofino.
it's as simple as a Wayne Gretzky thing, right? I just got to score that many goals, and then I can step down, make the record book. Well, it probably fits with his
That
personality, right? But
Well, and it's also it's tough to tell where we go from here. We don't see a specific cabinet minister with the gravitas to say I want to lead the party into the next campaign. Part of what happens when the early stages of the government are built around a specific personality is everybody else pales in comparison. And I
yeah,
think this is where we're headed. It's tough for people. It's not as difficult. It wasn't difficult when Chrétien stepped down. Oh, Paul Martin, he's there. He'll be the leader. Boom. And he starts with an approval rating in the 50s. And then everything sort of falls after that. But there's nobody right now who you could point to who could pull that off.
do you think that's why Mark Carney's kind of coming in through the back door, and they're trying to groom him to step up?
That might be part of it. And, it's not there's another component, which is there's hardly a liberal premier or ex-premier in the entire country who would like to say, oh, now I want this job. And we used to have people from New Brunswick or from Ontario who you would look at as possible candidates. I hear rumors that Christy Clark might be considering this. Technically a liberal because that was the name of the party. But here in British Columbia, possibly more aligned with the Conservatives because of the policies. But that just shows you how wide open this is. You could have a former athlete or a former news anchor, a former premier from BC saying, I want to do this if Justin Trudeau could.
Yeah, it would have to be like, I would assume that it would be like they take it on because it'd be almost like not a great move to win the election, but likely a good way to build into the next 4 years or something.
Well, and that's also part of it. You have to be ready for an 8-year ordeal that might end up with you forming the government. And it's a significant sacrifice for somebody who wants to actually take that.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on the BC election before I let you go?
Well, we'll see where this takes us. It's a close race. I think there's a possibility for the two main leaders to try to connect on a more emotional basis. Drop the situation related to be fearful of the other guy, or everything is the fault of the guy who's calling the shots now. So it's going to help us try to figure out where we go from here. And to me, it's eerily reminiscent of 1996. We could have a situation where the Conservatives get more votes by 1 point or 2 as far as percentages, but they can't climb the charts in Metro Vancouver, and the NDP forms the government. And I was just researching this. The number one song in Canada when the May 1996 election happened in BC was "Ironic" by Alanis Morissette. So I think it really would be ironic if we have the same type of election 28 years later.
It'd be interesting to see if it's like a very close race like it was back when Christy Clark lost, and that the Greens then have the balance of power. And I'd be interested to see which way she would go, because she seems to be attacking Eby more than she is attacking John Rustad.
Well, I think it's a calculated attack. She wants to be seen as a more progressive option. You're not doing the things you were supposed to be doing on the environment, and you've taken a position on involuntary care that goes against the principles of the party you represent. She wants to get that young voter to look at her as somebody who's more progressive. But I think anything can happen. If there's a couple of Greens, if there's a couple of independents who ultimately decide the color of the government, it's really tough to tell where they would go at this point, because the sacrifices that we're going to see on both sides are going to be huge. My favorite example of this is an election in Germany where the Greens held a balance of power, and they essentially said whoever phases out nuclear power plants gets our support and forms the government. And the Social Democrats went, we'll do it.
Do you think the mess of the BC United folding is behind John Rustad, or is that going to be one thing that haunts him?
I think it'll be interesting to watch if this becomes a race that is decided by 4 or 5 seats. Let's say the NDP forms the government and the Conservatives get within 4 or 5 seats of defeating them. They will have to look back at where they lost. And if they lost ridings where the candidates were severely criticized, these are people who maybe signed up when John Rustad was at 4% in the polls. And it's the type of scenario that the BC United handlers and Kevin Falcon for a time wanted. Let's just split things, let us nominate 20, 30 people, and then we can go from there. If this is decided by the seats where the candidates running for the BC Conservatives were criticized mercilessly, then the onus is going to be on John Rostad to explain himself. And ultimately, this is a fight for whatever happens afterwards. Are we going to see a coalescing of all the forces, BC United maybe disappearing officially and becoming part of the Conservative Party, or having a convention and trying to figure out where we go from here? That is what led, in a way, to the massive victory that we saw from Gordon Campbell's BC Liberals back in 2001. They had 5 years to get ready to essentially decimate a government that wasn't popular because they had fewer votes.
Last question, back to the Greens. Andrew Weaver comes out in support of John Rustad, says he trusts John Rustad more with the climate than he does David Eby. How do you think that plays into what Sonia Furstenau is thinking if, if she happens to hold the cards?
There's probably not a lot of people who dislike each other as vehemently as Andrew Weaver and Sonia Furstenau. That has been evident for years in statements, in moments, in specific things that they've said. It's understandable for the environmental movement to go, really? Weaver is endorsing the BC Conservatives. But to me, it also speaks about a certain level of dissatisfaction with David Eby as far as certain things that they expected the NDP to do. To be fair, he's also been critical of the BC Conservative campaign. He wrote something a couple of days ago where he said that it seems like it was written by a bunch of 20-year-olds. And there are certain parts of the language.
I think a lot of it always gets written by a bunch of 20-year-olds because they're all volunteers.
Well, exactly, right? That is also part of what is going to make this election so compelling. Yes, you have a center-right party that is climbing the charts and dominating, but is this the juggernaut that always got the vote out, that always figured out who to call, that always made it past the 42, 43, 44% mark and secured governments? It's tough to tell because there wasn't an amalgamation of the two forces. If you had given BC United's lists and wherewithal to get the vote out to the BC Conservatives, they would be at 50% by now.
Well, again, I thank you for your time, and we'll check in a couple more times before this one. And, of course, the U.S. election. There's a lot of us of us will be sitting here with bowls of popcorn, and you'll be out there working working hard, right? So. Oh,
totally. This is the way elections are in the States. Everything's bigger. It's like the Super Bowl for us.
Yeah, no, it's a big thing for sure, right? I mean, it's people are actually glued to that, right? I mean, they put out so much media on it, though, too, right? It's such a and they have a lot more media too. I mean, all our media is kind of like hanging on by a thread, right? So,
well, and this also shows us how much our relationship with the U.S. has changed. When the first election I experienced in Canada from the United States was 2000. You had to tune on CNN. We didn't have Peter Mansbridge telling us that Florida was at play. How things have changed.
I'll leave you with a thought, and it's an interesting thought. For the change in the Liberal government, like for us, we are really can't wait for change because Bill C-18 is really harming us, and I think it's harming media across the nation. But I talked to somebody from, I won't say the name, but one of the national places, and they said they fear a change in government because it'll be the end of their jobs, right? So I think that one of the thoughts there is I think government should get out of the way of media because here's one part of media that's can't wait for change because it they take the foot off our throat, and then the other part is thinking that it's going to actually end them. So media shouldn't be in that position.
Well, it's not their call. I mean, ultimately, what you have to do is present the points of view and try to figure out where we go from here. It's not a situation that has been conducive to saving everything. I think part of the problem with Bill C-18 and the way the government has been trying to manage this, if this were working, we wouldn't have our friends or colleagues leaving their jobs because the money isn't there. So, we don't have a time machine to go back to the invention of the internet and say we have to pay for all of these things because this is the only way to generate the news that we can generate. But I don't think the solution is, essentially saying we will subsidize you a little bit because there's always the implied possibility of impropriety between the media and the government that it covers.
Well, even the subsidies, we're still seeing the bankruptcies, right? We're still seeing, look at Chorus. We're still, it's not preventing anything. It's probably just a slower, more painful death.
Well, and it certainly doesn't help anybody. We have an opportunity to cover things differently, to have the chance to figure, especially in the context of an election, right? You want to have somebody talking to the candidates and then trying to figure out things. It's absolutely necessary, and we just don't have the perfect solution for it. What is great for some media outlets is something that is seen as inherently detrimental by others. So there's no perfect solution to this.
Yeah, they just get out of the way. That's all I would like. And free and independent, that's the way I'd like to see it. And again, thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you again. You've been very generous with your time, and we appreciate that. And we appreciate you watching Kelowna Now.
My pleasure, Jim. Anytime.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent. News you can trust.